Good evening, everyone. My name is Jill Max, and I am the director of the Baltimore Hebrew Institute at Towson University. It's hard to believe that our last in-person lecture took place on March 6, 2020. Since that time, we've all grown accustomed to Zooming in to connect with scholars and speakers around the world. When we first arranged to invite tonight's guest to speak, we intended to be together in our lecture hall in the College of Liberal Arts. However, once we realized there remained too many unknown variables as well as virus variants, we opted to keep this program virtual. We look forward to welcoming the community to our closing program at the Gordon Center for the Performing Arts in April, and I'll tell you more about that at the end of tonight's lecture. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to thank our program coordinator, Diane Siegel, for all of her hard work on the logistics of this event, and Teresa Jenkins, our wonderful building coordinator who always helps us with our technology. If you have questions during this talk for our lecturer, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. We'll be collecting your questions and giving them to Dr. Lerner for her to answer at the end of her presentation. And now a few words about tonight's guest. Bernice Lerner is the author of All the Horrors of War, The Triumph of Wounded Souls, and a co-author of Happiness and Virtue Beyond East and West, Toward a New Global Responsibility. Before and after she served as director of Boston University's Center for Character and Social Responsibility, where she is now a senior scholar, Bernice worked at Hebrew College, most recently as Dean of Adult Learning. All told, she has more than 25 years of experience in the field of adult education. It has been her great privilege, she says, to create and implement innovative programs, lead productive teams, and work with outstanding faculty in the realms of philosophy, education, and Jewish studies. Dr. Lerner has lectured widely and in various settings, including in Indonesia, for the Ministry of Education in Singapore, and at the University of Hiroshima, Japan. In the US, she has given presentations at numerous conferences and addressed faculty and staff of both private and public schools. Dr. Lerner earned a bachelor's degree summa cum laude from Stony Brook University and a master's from the Jewish Theological Seminary, and her doctorate from Boston University. Among the courses she taught at Boston University were resistance during the Holocaust and character and ethics education. She also designed and taught ethical decision-making for education leaders for Northeastern University's College of Professional Studies. Welcome, Dr. Lerner. We look forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much. Can everyone hear me? Okay. Thank you so much, Jill, and thank you to Diane and Teresa and to the Baltimore Hebrew Institute and Towson University. It's an honor to be addressing you this evening. And thank you to everyone who's here, to all the participants who chose to attend this seminar. I know there's a lot of things competing for your time right now. So I'm going to share my screen now and begin my presentation. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you about the ethics of rescue, true stories behind Bergen-Belsen's liberation, and it's really up to you whether you can sort of extrapolate from this and think of other tragedies and cataclysms from which mass rescue is needed. So I am the author of All the Horrors of War, A Jewish Girl, a British Doctor, and the Liberation of Bergen-Belsen. And I'm just showing you the cover of the book here on the left, and on the right is the UK version of the book, which was published at the same time. And even though the different presses were furnished with the same images and text, they came up with completely different concepts for the cover. But I just wanted you to see them because I wanted you to see the two protagonists that I'm going to be talking about. One, you can see her standing on the right. That is my mother, and that is my mother right after she turned 16 years old. This is about 6-7 months after the war, and she is in a tuberculosis sanitarium in snowy northwest Sweden called Arvika. And this is one of the first pictures we have of her. We have nothing of her from before the war. And you can see her expression. You can look in her eyes and see that maybe she recovered from her wounds. Maybe she gained some weight and has nutrition now, but she was in very, very bad shape at the end of the war. She almost did not survive. It was very close to me not being here speaking with you, but owing to the race against time story, to the fact that the British liberators arrived when they did, she had a chance at survival. And I became very curious about who masterminded the rescue, and that the name of the person is Glenn Hughes. So Brigadier Glenn Hughes, you can see on the bottom of All the Horrors of War, on the top of To Meet in Hell, that is Glenn Hughes. He's probably startled by the cameraman, and he's in his caravan in the vicinity of Bergen-Belsen at the time. He was very high up in the hierarchy. He was at this point Deputy Director of Medical Services for the British Second Army. So I had quite the challenge in terms of how to tell this dual biography once I decided I wanted to cover the lives of two protagonists from very different worlds in one book. So the way I've told the story is really as this race against time rescue story that took place over the last very dramatic year of World War II. This was already, so much had happened in the war by this point, but for these two protagonists, the spring of 1944 propelled them into this year-long journey where they finally converged in hell. So what I did was I told the story over 4 seasons, and the 5th season, the point of convergence in Bergen-Belsen, where my mother lays dying and the British enter the camp. That is the meat of the book, and it is sandwiched between a few paragraphs describing the Belsen trial, which is really significant. It really talks about what the Allies found when they entered the camp. And you can see on the right, there is an image from Army Talks magazine from November 1945, like right after the war. That is an image of the courtroom in a makeshift gymnasium in Lüneburg, Germany. And it is significant, and I wanted it to be part of my story because it was the first trial to apply international law to the war crimes that were committed. And it's not very well known, but it immediately preceded the Nuremberg trials. In fact, it had to end just as the Nuremberg trials were starting. So it was September 17th to November 17th, 1945. And the first witness at this trial, setting the tone for this international war crimes case, was Glenn Hughes. And then the book is further sandwiched between a prologue and an epilogue, where I get to tell some really important and significant things about both my mom and what brought her to the war, and how she was really affected by what we now know as the Holocaust from the very beginning, practically, to the epilogue, where I talk about what happens to the protagonists after and how they are shaped by their witnessing, and in my mother's case, enduring the extreme. And here, just on the right and set on the bottom, I have, these are just the Nazi defendants. Only 45 of the SS were brought to trial. There were 420 Nazi functionaries at Bergen-Belsen at the end of the war. Most escaped in the days right before the liberation. 80 had to remain to facilitate the handover of the camp, and only 45 were brought to trial. And this is number 9 is Irma Gracie, who's became a very compelling character to journalists all over, because she was very young and very beautiful. She was beheaded when she was 22 for her crimes. And there's a lot, it's just, her sadism was really notable. So what I'm going to do in this presentation is I'm going to tell you just about a few markers on the journey that last year of the war. So you can see Glenn Hughes is starting, he's coming from the west to the east, and my mom is coming from the east to the west. So the story begins in the spring of 1944 when Glyn Hughes is at this point head of the British Second Army's 8th Corps, which would go on to see the most ferocious fighting of the war. And they are practicing in the Yorkshire Wolds in northeastern England, these low hills in the counties of East Riding of Yorkshire and North Yorkshire that rise to a ridge and then slope down. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what happens on D-Day, June 6th, and where my mother is on D-Day. And then I'll tell you just a little bit about what Glyn Hughes is thinking and doing as the British Second Army is fighting, and as they eventually land in Bergen-Belsen. And here's my mom's journey from Siget. She had never been outside her town of Siget. She was 14 years old when she was forced to leave with her parents, with her family, with the entire community, as they were being taken to Auschwitz. And then she is miraculously taken out of Auschwitz and in a labor camp, and then the death march, and then winds up in Bergen-Belsen. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about what happens on their journey, the bigger picture and the context, and then focus a little bit on the liberation. So here's the Yorkshire Wolds, and they were chosen because they resembled the topography in Normandy, where the Allied forces would be landing and fighting. And so they practiced there. And I'm just going to mention that Glyn Hughes was a stalwart for practice and preparedness, which is really significant when it comes to his story in that last year of the war. And so he had people, casualty clearing stations, regimental aid posts. Everyone had to know how to quickly assemble and disassemble facilities as they would be fighting. And here is where people are practicing because it resembled Normandy. And my mom's journey began in Siget. And as I mentioned to you, very sadly, we don't have a single photograph of her from her childhood. I do not know what my grandparents look like. Her younger brother and 3 younger sisters were murdered in Auschwitz. I don't have a picture of them. So I can just tell you that from her memory, she was able to draw the street that she lived on, where she lived, and just some landmarks in the area. So it was very meaningful for me, and very meaningful for me when I visited Siget just before the pandemic. I was lucky to go there. And so to me, the streets all have different names now because now it's in Romania, but to me, it was always these names that were Hungarian names, which it was Hungary at the time of the war. And she lived in a strip of apartments and buildings between Timar Utca and Kigyo Utca. And here she wrote, here's our apartment. They were poor. They lived in a poor area, although for her, some of the people around who had more seemed very wealthy. And I should just tell you that Elie Wiesel's house is right over here. So, and Elie Wiesel and my mom's dad were friendly. They belonged to the same temple on Timar Utca. So Siget is a beautiful town. Nothing was the same when I went there, of course, because Elie Wiesel's son was on our trip with us, and he told us that he had come previously with his father, who said there are 2 Sigets. There's Siget as it exists now, and Siget Mihashamayim from the heavens, and that's how he remembered it. So I could not see the flourishing Jewish life that was before the war, where the population it was about maybe 32,000 people, and 40% were Jewish, and it really the rhythm of the Jewish holidays just was felt by everybody in the town. But I could see where the roads were, and I could see the layout of the town. And of course, the mountains hadn't changed. And I could see how far certain distances were. I could follow trace the tracks my mom and her family had to take when they were deported from the train station, from their home to the train station. So Siget is located right here in northern Romania. You can see that it's on the border with the Ukraine. In fact, when the war began, there were like within like 2 or 3 days, there were thousands of people lined up from the Ukraine to cross the border. It's walking distance to get over into Romania, into Siget. And so again, today it's Romania. It was Romania for the first 10 years of my mom's life. And then the Hungarians came in and took this whole area that was northern Transylvania. So here's Siget right here. And again, like right over here, like Usha Road is now in the Ukraine. In fact, my father's lived near here, and this is all the Ukraine now. So the borders, this is a land where the borders kept changing. So now I'm going to skip to June 6th. Of course, my book has the details of what happened between now and then, but in June 6th, my mother was in Auschwitz. And on June 6th, as you know, 150,000 Allied troops landed on the coast of Normandy in this magnificent invasion in the annals of military history. Nothing like it. 7,000 boats, completely duped the Germans, who thought they would be landing on the coast of Calais. They came here instead, and it was just, in my book I cite these various places where Glenn Hughes came on D-Day +6 and commandeered hospitals in Bayeux and other places, and this is where the fighting, the really severe fighting began. But what's really noticeable is that on this day where you had so many Allied troops, there were half the number of Allied soldiers killed as the number of human beings who were killed on Auschwitz on that day. Moreover, every day after that, while the fighting was terrible in Normandy, up through France, up through Belgium and the Netherlands, well, it was just brutal and frightening and all the horrors of war, really. The numbers of deaths of Allied soldiers decreased each day, whereas in Auschwitz, they remained the same. Number of people were being murdered each day until way into July. And this was the largest deportation and the fastest killing of the largest number of people in the entire war. There was more than 426,000 Hungarian Jews from the provinces, from the area my mother lived, were taken in rapid fire, fast method ways to Auschwitz. And a new railway spur was built in Birkenau so they shouldn't have to walk. And I'm just going to show you some images. I have different images in my book. I'm really going to tell you about some different things. But these images of the people, this is from the Hungarian transport from Beregszász, that was Hungary at the time, and 2 SS officers. They don't know exactly which one, but they were in charge of photographing for IDs or something, and they documented this. This is a very amazing document from the Holocaust. It's called the Auschwitz album. 193 photos were rescued and found by a survivor in an album, and it was called the Auschwitz album. And they documented the killing process, everything up until like the gas chambers. They couldn't photograph what was happening inside there. So here you see it looks very organized and orderly. The men are divided from the women in this photograph, but it is not really, it's really quite chaotic. People do not know where they are. And if you took a microscope and you zoomed in, or even a magnifying glass, you could see a mother maybe turning to talk to a child. You could see the men like turning and talking to each other. Where are we? They had just had this really tortured journey of several days in this cattle wagon with barely any air and no place to go to the bathroom. And it was just a horrific experience. And they landed, they're happy to get out and get fresh air, but they have no idea where they've landed. Just SS officers barking orders along with dogs being sicked on people. So it's a lot of terror. Again, these photographs, I'm just showing a few because they're just so valuable. And these are the people who are selected for the gas chamber. You can see a lot of children and elderly women from this transport. And here are women who were considered strong and were selected to work. And my mom would look at this photograph and say, oh, these women are lucky because they had kerchiefs for their hair. She had nothing like that. And this is a story that is another subject that maybe should be a book in itself, which is the plunder, the amount of theft, of taking the goods of all these people, all these Jews all over Europe. And here is just this area in Auschwitz called Canada. You might be familiar with it. The inmates called it that because it was so vast. There were so many goods and suitcases and every kind of thing imaginable being brought into Auschwitz because people did not know where they were being taken and what they might need. So I'm gonna just skip ahead a little bit and show you now that while this is going on in Auschwitz, while the mass killing is taking place in this factory of death, the Allied soldiers are fighting, and they're fighting these battles. And I'm going to show you a couple of things that I lifted from Glyn Hughes's archives in London. And there's boxes and boxes and boxes. So it was a challenge to make sense of the story, but I'm just going to show you a few things about him and how his mind worked. So here's a chart of D+1, D+2, D+3, D-Day, and the number of days after D-Day. And this is the number of casualties. And here's Neptune Beach casualties. And he's calculating he has columns. How many people have died in battle? How many have died from drowning? What kind of casualties? How many need to be evacuated? And then as the war goes on, how many beds he's finding in these various places? And what is this high level planning and thinking about? And the kind of special units he has to bring in, the neurosurgical units, maxillofacial units, and everything is planned out. As much as you have to improvise in battle and he has to find places, a lot of things are detailed, like how long a surgery would take in one of the field hospitals, really down practically to the second. And here's some just images that I lifted. This is when the German army enters the town of Lingen, crosses over into the Reich. The fortress of Germany has been breached, and some of the German soldiers are waving white flags and surrendering. Here's some fighting in a town. Here's some celebrating as the British army comes in, and the people in the towns are cheering them. And this is just a little bit of British kind of humor. If you want to see Blighty, Britain again, camouflage your vehicles, and between these points your enemy lies, and he, like you, can use his eyes. So show no light and he won't get wise. And it shows where the enemy is. So another point in the timeline that is not really part of my mom's story or Glyn Hughes's story is what happens in January of 27th. Oh, excuse the typo here, in 1945, and that is the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau. And I want to just show you this because I want to stress that by the end of the war, when my mother landed in Bergen-Belsen and Glyn Hughes liberated Bergen-Belsen, it was the place where there was the largest number of inmates. In a sense, it was how it all ended. How did it all end? So the liberation of Auschwitz, by the time the Russians came to Auschwitz, the three parts of Auschwitz, the largest parts of the complex, Birkenau, where most of the Jews were killed, 2 miles from Auschwitz I, Auschwitz proper, 4 miles from Auschwitz III, which is Buna, which means synthetic rubber, where they used a lot of slave labor. There were only this many people remaining in the camp because in mid-January, the Germans knew that they were losing, the Russians were coming soon, and they started to evacuate the inmates. The order was that no inmates should fall alive into Allied hands. So you had fewer than 8,000 people in Auschwitz. So where did they go? So you had in this beginning in January 1945, things are looking very bad for Germany, right? They lost already. This was way past the Battle of Stalingrad. They have had terrible losses. And so they start to evacuate people um, as they are about to be liberated by the Russians. They evacuate them deep, deep, deep into Germany. So here are the death marches that occurred. There were about 714,000 people alive, prisoners alive in January of 1945. And 1/3 of them will die on these death marches, where they are just marched in the bitter cold of winter, freezing winter that winter in Eastern Europe and into Western Europe. Not adequate clothing, barely any food, barely a place to sleep, and they're being marched. And anyone who could not keep up, and there are already so many exhausted people, were shot on the spot. So all along the way, there are bodies. And so here's Auschwitz, and starts out, I mean, the death marches took place in all kinds of directions, but mostly they were going west and west toward deep into Germany and southwest this way. And I described my mom's experience, of course, during this death march in the book. But here you could see Bergen-Belsen and Bergen-Belsen really deep inside Germany. So when the Allied liberators eventually did come to these various places, Flossenburg and Dachau and other places, they found these people who had once, these were the strong ones, right? These were the people who were in their 20s and 30s, and they were fit and able to work for the German war effort, which is why they were kept alive. They evaded the gas chambers in Auschwitz. They had already survived the death marches, and they wound up in these places. And the largest number wound up in Bergen-Belsen. So by the time the British entered Bergen-Belsen, there were 60,000 of these really war-worn inmates, of whom my mom was one. So April 15th, 1945 is when Bergen-Belsen was liberated. Mind you, this is 3 weeks before the end of the war, right? The Victory in Europe Day was May 8th. So it was 3 weeks before. It's truth is stranger than fiction story about why Heinrich Himmler, who was hell-bent on killing as many Jews as possible from the beginning of the war, decided to turn this camp over to the British Second Army before the end of the war, because he had orders not to turn over any camp with any inmate alive, and he gave those orders to certain other camps that they were to kill everyone before the Allies were approaching, as Allies were approaching. But on Bergen-Belsen in April 15th, 1945, the British finally did enter. They entered into a truce with the German army on April 12th. Now, I'll just tell you one thing. On April 12th, the Germans knew they were going to hand over this hellish place to the British. And mind you, they had all these inmates that were arriving, that were being deposited in Bergen-Belsen, and it became a veritable hell. They had no housing for them, no medical facilities, no food, hardly any food. And then the last 5 days, no food, no clean water, no place to house these people. And on April 12th, there were corpses laying everywhere, and they decided they were going to have a cleanup of the camp before the Allies arrived. So they pressed those inmates who still had some life in them into service to walk down this road bisecting this large camp with 3 compounds on one side and 2 on the other, to a mass grave at the end of the road to clean up the corpses, which were littered everywhere. And I can tell you probably the origins of this book, the way it started was when I was probably around a young teenager, maybe 14 years old myself, when I was talking to my mom, and we were down in the laundry room, and she demonstrated for me how she, who was 50% dead, she leaned over, she stretched her arms out behind her, and she showed me how she, who was 50% dead, was dragging people, some 90% dead, some who were still breathing, down this road to a mass grave. Of course, she didn't have this image then, but she painted the image for me at the same time as she said, nothing can describe what it was like. No picture, no image, no movie could show it. And I hope you don't have nightmares, she said to me. So this is, I'm just going to show you, I show you with a little bit of trembling what it was like when the British entered. This is the most photographed camp. So a lot of times when you see images just in general about the Holocaust at the end of the war, you'll see these photographs that were taken by the British Film and Photographic Unit. And I tremble showing them to you, but I want to explain things. So I want to illustrate certain things. So here, as I mentioned, 80 SS officers remained in the camp for the transition and the turnover. So here are British Tommies, soldiers, supervising these guards who are forced to help with the cleanup of the camp. Here are well enough, healthy enough displaced persons, survivors watching and jeering at them. Here is one of the mass graves. There were 15 of these, I believe. They were 12 feet deep, 20 to 30 feet wide, 40 to 50 feet long. Here is Rabbi Leslie Hardman, who is a chaplain that came in with the British Second Army, who is totally bereft at the way people are being buried, helter-skelter in these mass graves. He was going out of his mind. That he had to beg Glenn Hughes, and he got some relief. Here is a sign marking a grave. Now, today, if you would go to Bergen-Belsen, there's a beautiful monument. Here it says 5,000 are buried here in grave number 2. I have to tell you, honestly, it was a lot of guesswork. Some graves said 10,000, some said 2,000. It was, in the end, a lot of guesswork. There is a beautiful monument there where Margot and Anne Frank are buried. I don't know how they chose this spot. I read somewhere that someone claimed they knew where they died. Definitely, they were not buried here. Definitely, they were buried in one of the mass graves. There are some individual tombstones in Bergen-Belsen. Some people managed to get their relatives buried privately, but only about like 17, not many. And here, this image I wanted to show you because this girl has a big square cut out of her coat and back. And it reminded me that these people mostly came from labor camps, death marches, where some of them, if they were in labor camps, they got the clothing that had been stolen from the inmates in Auschwitz. They shipped them to some of these camps where they needed people to work and function and still be in okay shape. And they all had like squares cut out of the back. Lest they escape, they should be easily identifiable as halfling. So here are more images of the squalor. And of course, it all reminds me, not all, but a lot of it reminds me of things, little anecdotes that my mom shared with me, including when she and her sister were managed to get some potatoes and cook them. And you can see that the inmates are completely inured to what's taking place in the background, and also to the smell that really hit the British soldiers when they first came in. And another thing that was very significant to me, like you could look at these pictures and not really make much of them, but 3 days after the liberation, the British 11th Light Field Ambulance came in and pitched a dump of tentage to get people from the huts. They called these huts, these structures, to relieve the overcrowding there. Anyone who could still walk was asked to go into a tent. So my mom has quite a story about being well enough to go into a tent that she shared with 4 other girls, and then being kicked out of the tent and having to go back to the hut where she was beaten to a pulp by her fellow inmates and fell unconscious. And that is part of the reason I had to write the book, because I didn't really know what happened to her after that point. How was she rescued? So a lot of things happened during the liberation. People don't understand what a liberation means from a death camp like this. Um, it wasn't like, oh, the liberators are here, everyone's cheering. Sometimes you'll see those pictures of survivors smiling. Oh, the sun is shining and the sky is blue and life is wonderful. We're free, we're free. It was a very complicated and complex, and it took a long time to liberate the camp. And just one thing is that the water and electricity were sabotaged by the SS before they left. So British had to find a way of pumping in water into the camp. And then these are just images of people from the town and the burgermeisters, the mayors from the neighboring towns, whom Glenn Hughes ordered to the camp to see what had taken place there. The rescue began. It took a while to get organized. It took probably about a week after the liberation. It took time because, as I mentioned, Glenn Hughes, who was a stalwart for preparedness, came into Bergen-Belsen. He had seen all the horrors of war. He testified in the trial that he had seen all the horrors of war, but nothing to touch this, nothing to touch it. He broke down crying because he initially had no idea how he was going to organize the rescue, how he was going to try to save as many lives as possible. And he was really a humanitarian, and he was morally motivated to do this. So he brought in his medical personnel, as many as he could. He diverted some of his officers because there was a battle raging right in Northwest Germany. Every unit was already engaged, and he had to divert resources. And about a week after the liberation, it was all set up in kind of a triage style, which was they were going to evacuate people very systematically, going hut by hut, and take them in these contaminated ambulances to this horse stables that was converted into a human laundry, where they had about 60 tables, and they were going to sort of factory style wash down those inmates who still had a little bit of life in them, who were really skeletal, and spray them with DDT to get rid of the typhus germ. You have to realize that at least 3 virulent epidemics were raging in Bergen-Belsen at the time of the liberation. Typhus, tuberculosis, and gastroenteritis. Everybody had that, almost everybody, unless they had some immunity from before with the typhus, and lots of other diseases. So here you can see the men from the 11th Light Field Ambulance who are wearing protective clothing as they're evacuating these inmates and putting them in the ambulance. And my mom didn't know until I did my research that this was called the human laundry, but she had her own heartbreak while after she roused for a minute because she had fallen unconscious. She really was heartbroken at the human laundry. A lot of people, by the way, they pressed German nurses from the area into cleaning the inmates and washing them down. And that's a whole story in itself, both their reaction and that of the inmates who were being cleaned by them. So here I'm going to read from the bottom just some numbers just to give you a sense of things. So one thing you should know, and one of the reasons that compelled me to write this book, is that Glenn Hughes was this humanitarian, and he was noticed by the survivors, his caring and his compassion, especially by those who were helping with the medical relief, those survivors who were well enough at the war's end to work with him. Because there were some who had arrived only recently from other places, and they were the ones who were in better shape. So they named the hospital complex on the premises the largest hospital in Europe, the Glenn Hughes Hospital. And there were 14,000 patients in it on May 19th, more than 1 month after the liberation. It took 2 weeks for the backlog of corpses to be buried in Bergen-Belsen. 500 former inmates died each day for a month after the liberation. It took a long time to stem the tide of death. There were only 361 British Army soldiers and medical personnel working in the relief of Bergen-Belsen on April 17th, 2 days after the liberation. and 750 to 1,000 sick were processed each day for over 3 weeks after liberation at the human laundry. And I think my mom, according to some things I was able to deduce, was one of the first ones to be evacuated and go through the human laundry and be placed in a makeshift hospital room. 25,000 were fit, able to walk. If you could walk up like 3 steps to get onto a truck, you were considered fit. And they were taken to formerly Wehrmacht Transit and Rehabilitation Barracks, which became the start of what would become the displaced persons camp. And my aunt was one of these. She was separated from my mom. They didn't know where each other was after the liberation. My aunt was considered fit. I should mention that this was very fungible, like you could be able to walk and then collapse, and people got sick after. They went back and forth from this place to the hospital. Finally, on if the rescue in earnest really, I mean, there was food and water brought in right away, but the rescue really took place from April 23rd to May 21st. Finally, the last hut was evacuated, and the Glenn Hughes gave the order for it. All the huts were burned down after they were evacuated because of the typhus germ, but he gave the order to torch this last one in this ceremony. When finally the Union Jack, the British flag, was raised, it was not raised on May 8th, Victory in Europe Day, was not even recognized here in Bergen-Belsen. Here's a sign leading to the British Glenn Hughes Hospital. Here's the largest part of it. And here is Glenn Hughes. And it was just a really significant moment, the torching of the last hut. And here you can see that this little country off the coast of Sri Lanka, the Maldives, issued these commemorative stamps for the 50th anniversary of the end of World War II. And one of them is of the burning down, British troops burned last hut at Bergen-Belsen. So here's the actual image, and here's the stamp that was created. You can see the effigy of Hitler burning. So the ethics of rescue, I just want to talk about Glenn Hughes and the kind of rescue he led. First, I want you to realize that he was morally motivated to save as many lives as possible. And you can think about this in terms of other rescues, right? Other catastrophes that are happening, that have happened in history, that are happening right now in the world. There was a real readiness to break rules, to do what had to be done. This was defied normal Army protocol, where he would have had to get permission or let Second Army headquarters know about certain things, and he didn't have time for that. He had to get food and water in immediately. There was a lot of resourcefulness. I mean, how are you going to get like 25,000 blankets? Like, you don't have bedpans, you don't have beds, you don't have all this equipment. So like at one of the evening meetings, Glenn Hughes would meet with his Army personnel every night. They presented this problem, like, we need like 18,000 blankets. So he said, go into the neighboring town of Celle, tell the mayor, every single person has to hand in 1 blanket by tomorrow. And they did, and they got the blankets, and people had to surrender, like people in the neighborhood had to surrender 1/3 of their wardrobe. And how did they get clothing in? And then how did they distribute it to the inmates? All of these things involved a lot of resourcefulness. Decisive action, like, what are you gonna do? Like, yeah, people, the humane thing is to give people a proper burial. But with the warm weather coming and the risk of cholera, Glenn Hughes had no choice but to order these burying people in mass graves. Compassion, and this is what I think the inmates witnessed a lot in Glenn Hughes. I'll just tell you one little story. The day after he stepped in, he was there the first day of the liberation. He came that afternoon. I think it was 1 or 2 days later, he was given a tour of the camp by one of the inmates who was strong enough. And there was a woman, a gynecologist there, who was delivering the first free baby born in Bergen-Belsen. And the gynecologist ran out. She had bloody, dirty hands. She had no water or disinfectant or anything. And she grabbed his sleeve And she said, you know, I need help. This is what's happening now. My patient is dying. She's like, blood is gushing from her typhus infected body. And he immediately, like, he broke out in tears, but he immediately, within a half an hour, she got everything she needed. He just saw to it. And then there was this sort of thing in him, this 52-year-old Brigadier Hughes. He had this sort of receptivity to unfolding phenomena. And really what happened in the subsequent months, as the survivors were slowly organizing themselves into really a vibrant displaced persons community, he witnessed all this, and his job was done at the end of the war, but he kept coming back to Bergen-Belsen, and he forged this relationship with some of these survivors who were leaders and who were part of this community that lasted his entire life. So this is just one of the stories that gives you a sense of, I jumped ahead and told you that this vibrant displaced community formed, but it took time, right? And there was nobody who survived who had not lost, like, most of the members of their family. I mean, they were bereft. There was all kinds of things going on. There's a lot of little anecdotes in my book, but this is not in my book. So I just wanted to share it with you. It was shortly after the British Red Cross arrived, though it may have no connection, that a very large quantity of lipstick arrived. This was not at all what we men wanted. We were screaming for hundreds and thousands of other things, and I don't know who asked for lipstick. I wish so much that I could discover who did it. It was the action of genius, sheer, unadulterated brilliance. I believe nothing did more for these internees than the lipstick. Women lay in bed with no sheets and no nightie, but with scarlet red lips. You saw them wandering about with nothing but a blanket over their shoulders, but with scarlet red lips. So just all kinds of stories like this. So I'm going to just tell you a little bit about the Belsen DP camp, which was really an astounding story. Eventually there would be 12,000 DPs from Belsen and from other camps in Europe that came to Bergen-Belsen, to the DP camp, which was really a holding pen. Like, people had lost most of their families, and they were like, where are we going to make our life next? Like, yeah, the British wanted everybody to be repatriated, but if you came from France or Holland, but if you came from Poland or Hungary or Romania, you came from Eastern Europe, like, there were no homes to go back to. Your entire community was destroyed. So it was a very crazy, chaotic period. And there were people who survived most of the people who survived were young and healthy, right? They were strong. They were in their 20s and 30s, and some had been married before the war, but they had no idea where their spouse was if they survived. So a special Bergen-Belsen ketubah was created by the rabbis. 420 men and 300 women who had been married and didn't know the fates of their spouses were granted permission to remarry, with the caveat that if a former spouse showed up, they would have to be provided for materially in some way. So in Bergen-Belsen, in the displaced persons camp, in the period after the war, was the largest baby boom in human history. There were more than 2,000 babies born in the Glenn Hughes Hospital. People paired up and were so eager to rebuild and have families. It was a phenomenon. There, in a way higher rate than the German Fräulein in the area. They were not having babies like this. This was unbelievable. So there was a kindergarten established in school. The life revolved around these young couples and little ones. And there was a lot of resourcefulness here. There was a lot of amazing things among the survivors. So this survivor married this survivor, and she just wanted to get married in a white wedding gown. So he was working in the provisions area, and a German soldier came in with an old parachute, and he traded like two sacks of coffee beans for this parachute. And out of this parachute one of the seamstresses created this beautiful wedding gown with a very big bow and back. And this is another story like that. This is Gina Turgel, and she's married. She married one of the British liberators, one of the British soldiers. And he was able to get a British parachute, and out of this parachute silk was fashioned for her this gorgeous wedding dress, which is now in the Imperial War Museum. I think this is in the US Holocaust Memorial Museum, but this is definitely in the Imperial War Museum. And this young woman, she's 19 at the end of the war, and she finds some German officer's socks. She unravels the wool and with 2 sticks knits herself this sweater. So I'm just going to now go through quickly some images from the DP camp, because it's a story in itself. But but all these things were very moving to Glenn Hughes, who was observing them and who really became, on account of what he witnessed, I think, really committed to the Jewish people, by extension, the state of Israel. He really saw his role in the history of the Jewish people. But here was a concentration camp theater. There were some talented survivors who survived, who were actors, who put on these performances that were very cathartic because they reminded people of the experiences they had just been through. There was the Organization for Rehabilitation and Training, came to the camp, trained these people to become dental technicians, or work in electrical welding, or seamstresses, preparing for their future lives. There was a Jewish police force in the DP camp. This is just some things that were happening in Glenn Hughes Hospital. Here's a birth certificate from the Glenn Hughes Hospital of the second baby being born there. And this is an artist who did these charcoal drawings. He did a series of 11 of them while he was a patient in the hospital. And this one says, "We survived, what now?" And this is a newspaper that was produced pretty quickly. Green ink was a real novelty. It was produced in the nearby town of Sela, and it's called Our Voice. And I should tell you that it now exists today in a beautiful magazine, and you can find it online from the Bergen-Belsen organization in Israel. They produced this publication called Our Voice, survivors, descendants of survivors. And one of the most important things and moving things is that the survivors from all backgrounds, right? Religious, secular, all backgrounds were united around a common goal. And if you know anything about the politics of that time, you know that the British had their own interests in the Middle East, did not want Jews to immigrate to Palestine, but that is what the survivors were lobbying for. And this man, Yossel Rosensaft, this diminutive man, organized people. And you have to realize that some of these people who were young and strong, who survived, first of all, they arrived very late to Bergen-Belsen, maybe within a week of its liberation. And the other thing is that some of them had been very well trained before the war. They were members of Zionist youth organizations, and they knew how to organize. So they really helped to build the community. Here's a group of them. They organized a kibbutz already here, and here's visitors from the Jewish Brigade in Israel. They were fighters during the war, and it was really something for survivors to see Jews in uniform fighting. So now I'm going to play you a brief video, and this is of Rabbi Tzvi Asaria Herman Halfgott. And he was a Yugoslavian POW. He was trained to be a rabbi before the war. He helped people in the POW camp he was in Yugoslavia. And very soon after the war was over, he heard about Bergen-Belsen and went there to see how he could be of help.
לראות מי נפטר, להוציא אותם ולקבור אותם. אבל מה? הייתה פקודה מאנגלים שאי אפשר קבר אחים לעשות בגלל המחלות, אלא קבר אחים. קבר אחים. כולם יחד. כלומר, שורה אחת, נגיד 20-30, על זה כן סיד, כן, ועל זה שוב כן איזה 30-20 וזה, כמו שהיה במחנה המוות הזה, איפה שאלפים כן. אבל יום אחד ניגשה אליי אישה ואמרה לי, רבי, שמעתי היום שבבלוק הזה וזה, ביתי נפטרה. אז אמרתי, אז מה לעשות? אני רוצה קבר בשבילה, קבר יחיד. אמרתי, אבל זה בלתי אפשרי. אבל לכן אני מבקשת ממך. אז אמרתי לה, את יודעת מה? בלילה כשחיילים בדרך כלל, האנגלים, נמצאים במועדונים, אז אנחנו נקבור אותם. אנחנו נביא את הגופה, ואנחנו כן נקבור אותם. ובאמת, בלילה היא קמה מהמיטה, ואני ניסיתי מהר לקבור אותה, קדיש להגיד, ופתאום כשאני רציתי כבר סתום את הגולם, היא אומרת לי, רגע אחד רבי. והיא פנתה עם העיניים לשמיים ואמרה, ריבונו של עולם, ביידיש, אני מודה לך לזכות הגדולה שנתת לי היום לקבור את ביתי במו ידיים. אמן. מרגע זה, אני מוכרח להגיד, נעשיתי אדם אחר. עשינו עכשיו את הכל על מנת לעזור לאנשים, כן, בדרך לחיים. ופה התחלנו לאשכול לדאוג, היו כמה ילדים לגן ילדים, ואחר כך להקים בית ספר, כן. פה עזרו לנו הרבה אנשי בריגדה שהגיעו כבר בזמן הזה, כן, לברגן-בלזן גם כן. והקמנו כבר גם כן תיאטרון, כן. חיים חדשים התחילו, כן. ופה אני עסקתי עד 48, כן. פה בתורה, חתונות התחילו, כן. ברית מילות, כן, וכו' וכו' וכו'. ואני לא צריך להדגיש כמה שאני הייתי מאושר. כל משפחה רצתה שבברית מילה שאני נתת לכולם חופה וקידושים שאני אחזיק את הילד. היום המאושר ביותר בחיים שלי היה בילד האלף כשאני החזקתי בידיי. הילד האלף.
So that's my story. I fear I went on maybe too long. I really would like to have time for questions, but just as an epilogue, as a closing, I'll just show you some more images. Here's Glenn Hughes at the time of the war. You could sort of see the seriousness in his eyes. After the war, he did some really significant things that might, here he is as a sportsman. Someone could write a book about Glenn Hughes in sports because he was a father figure in England of rugby football. But if you've ever had an experience with hospice, it might be traced directly to him if you have anyone in your family who's ever been through that. Here's my mom in Sweden. My mom spent 10 years in and out of TB sanatoriums in Sweden after the war. And there she is with her sister, they're young ladies. And this is my dad, who was also a survivor. Here he is in a displaced persons camp in the south of Germany. And this is their wedding picture. And here's my mom today. And I'm really proud of her. She gives her testimony quite often these days. And that's my presentation. This sign was erected at the time of the liberation. It's no longer there. And here's how you can get in touch with me if you ever have a question about any of this. And I'll stop the share now.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lerner, for sharing that very personal and really, truly remarkable story. I think many of us, even if we've studied the Holocaust for a long time, don't know that much about the DP camps. And it's really important to hear that spark of hope. And I love the story about the red lipstick and the babies in particular. But a few questions we have so far. The first one was about when your mother was at Bergen-Belsen and you talked about her being beaten. Why was she beaten? Do you know? Does she know?
Yeah, so that's a story. It's a story, but she went back into the hut and just her compatriots just beat her up. And she would not ever incriminate them or say they were wrong. She just said, by that stage, we were all animals. And her last thought before she fell unconscious was, I'm never going to walk upright again, and we will never be human beings again.
Thank you. The next question is about Glenn Hughes. Did he keep detailed journals? How did you find out so much information about his experiences?
Yeah. So he didn't keep journals, but he gave lots of talks after the war. So I had all his talks, and I really tried to find out who he was. And I went through all his documents and his papers and but he never actually wrote a journal, but he did give quite a few speeches. So I had a lot of information from that. And I read everything that was written about him or by him as much as I could, until it got really too technical, like, like medical stuff that was beyond me.
Great, thank you. The next question, how long was the displaced persons camp in existence?
5 years after the war. I think the last person left in 1950.
And the last one, at the beginning, you said that number 9 was beheaded. Is that?
Yeah, so I think 11 got death sentences from the trial of 45. And I think they were all killed around December. And there was a few women, and I think she was the first woman to yeah. And there's a whole story with this guy Pierre Point, who was like the hangman, and it's a very technical thing to figure out how to hang somebody. So she wasn't beheaded. She was hung. They were all hung. That was a mistake. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, she was a character. She had her own story.
Thank you. And the last question we have up here is, did you reach out to the family of Glenn Hughes at all to hear any of his story?
Yeah, so the first thing I did was I tried to track down the family once I decided that I wanted to know more about him personally. So I tracked down his daughter, and that was like this is like a detective story, because first of all, how many Hugheses are there in the London phone book? And then, like, what's her married name? Like, so I just, I was able to track her down, and I spent a lot of time with her, visiting with her in her home. And she was very gracious. She laid out all Glenn Hughes's medals and his papers, and his other daughter had died, and his son was quite sick, but I did have a couple of phone interviews with him and exchange of letters. And then later on, I met his grandchildren much later on, but they didn't know him very well.
Thank you. Another question was, how did your mom get to the US?
So she was in Sweden for 10 years after the war. And my father had immigrated to the United States in 1948. And they were sort of match made, like his sisters met her sister at a party. They knew each other from labor camp. They started to write, and he went to Sweden to marry her. And then he brought her to the United States. So she began a new life here and had no clue about American life. She had come from Sweden. So she would see these commercials on television and think, how wonderful. They tell you they advise you what to buy. She had no clue. Hitchhiking was no big deal for her. I mean, she had come from a different society. So he had to educate her. Yeah.
And this last question is a great one to end the questions. Are all these other stories in your book?
Yeah, I tried to give a presentation around my book, but not what's in the book.
Great. And just for everyone to know, Dr. Lerner, we're going to put in the chat a link to Johns Hopkins Press, and also a code to get a 30% discount on her book. So you can find the book there, and you can go on her website also to read more about her biography and information about her background or anything else. And she also gave you her contact so that you can reach out to her. I definitely want to thank everyone for being here tonight. It really was lovely to have you and to hear this really interesting and important and personal story. And we really thank you for your time. Before we go, as I mentioned earlier, we hope that everyone will join us on April 24th at 5 p.m. at the Gordon Center for the Performing Arts for an evening as we welcome acclaimed author and educator Edgar Carrot for an evening of storytelling, honoring our community's educators and professionals. Please look for emails for this exciting event that was rescheduled from 2020. We're finally having it. Anyone who identifies as an educator or communal professional is entitled to a free ticket, but you do have to reserve them online. So please look for that. And again, thank you all for attending. And thank you, Dr. Lerner, for being here. We really appreciate it. And it was really lovely to hear your story.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a good night, everyone. Bye.